Hello everyone, we are coming in for our next video in our President series, which I mentioned last week would be our next video for this month, as I've been trying to do one a month. So this is going to be our last video here before, for the next, I'd say 2 weeks. What is it? Yeah, 2 weeks, because we will not have a video next week because I will not be home. I will be on vacation, so I will not be doing a video next week. This is the last for at least a 2 week. So 2 weeks from now, we'll have our next video. So for our next president, if you have been following along with that series, we are now on to president number 22, which is coincidentally also the 24th. So we're technically, this is an odd one here. And that would be President Grover Cleveland. And this is Mr. Cleveland. Wonderful Mr. Cleveland. Mr. Cleveland holds the distinction in American history of being the only president that has actually gotten 2 terms that were not consecutive. So far, he has been the only president to accomplish that. I know that we have one right now who is attempting that same feat, but time has not yet spoken of whether or not that will actually be done. And until then, he maintains that record. For now. We don't know what's going to happen in November. Everyone's got their own opinions, and that's their own thing. But as of right now, Grover Cleveland is the only president to have actually accomplished this, meaning it's not really easy to do. So Grover Cleveland, as a consequence, was our 22nd and our 24th president because of this. His first term was from 1885 till 1889. He was then voted out of office in the 1888 election. He lost his reelection bid, his initial one at least. He was out of office for 4 years, decided to run again in 1892, and actually managed to get reelected the second time around. And there was then had a second term as president from 1893 until 1897, where he would leave office for good at that point. And Cleveland is also going to have the distinction, he is going to be the first, really the first and one of only out of 2 presidents that we have between 1861 and 1933 that are going to be Democratic, because during this long span of United States presidential history, Republican candidates typically dominated the White House for some reason, mostly probably because of the factor of the Civil War had been so recent. People rallied around the Republican Party after the Civil War. The Democrats had actually been split during the Civil War, and they were in chaos for quite some time. And for the longest time, their main base was in the white supremacist South that still had Jim Crow laws and everything else. But there were a couple times they managed to get enough support in the North that they could tip a presidential election into their favor. And this was one of the few times during that time era that they managed to do this. The other one would be Woodrow Wilson from 1913 until 1921. But Grover Cleveland was a Democrat. So this is going to be a little bit of a break because we haven't had a Democratic president on this series since James Buchanan back before the Civil War. So, I mean, technically you could count Andrew Johnson, but Andrew Johnson was also running as part of the National Union Party, which was a coalition during the Civil War. That was what he was elected on, and even then, Andrew Johnson was not elected to be president. He was elected to be vice president. He simply became president because Abe Lincoln got shot. So it wasn't like he actually got elected to do that job. Not like Buchanan, who had been elected for president. That was what he was running for. So Grover Cleveland was born Stephen Grover Cleveland on March 18th, 1837. And if any one of you is wondering for the last name, yes, he is distantly related to the founders of the city of Cleveland that actually gave its name. So he does have somewhat of a relation with the city of Cleveland, Ohio, if anyone is wondering that. He was the 5th of 9 children of a Presbyterian minister, Richard Falley Cleveland, and his wife, Anne Neal Cleveland, and he was born in Caldwell, New Jersey. And his family ended up moving to upstate New York in 1841 when Grover was only a mere, 4 years old, where Richard, his father, since he was a Presbyterian minister, would actually preach to several congregations before his own death in 1853. Cleveland would leave school upon his father's death in 1853 to go out and make money for the family to help his family survive, because without the father, who back then, it was very much expected that the father was the one that would go out and actually make money for the family, and the mother was more or less expected to be a good housewife and good mother for the children and to stay home. Nowadays, that role is completely out of bounds with modern women, and rightly so. But back then, that was how society was. Well, now his dad is dead, the main money provider is dead, so everyone's gonna have to start pitching in here. All the children are helping their mother out, just trying to survive. And this happens in 1853 upon Richard's death. Cleveland would leave his school and begin to go to work in order to support the family. He couldn't afford college because of that, because they were struggling to get by, but he did work as a teacher at a blind school in New York City and as a clerk at a law firm in Buffalo, as some of the odd jobs that he took during this time frame in the 1850s in his youth. In 1859, Cleveland would pass his legal bar exam and be admitted to the New York State Bar, and he would end up starting a law firm in 1862. And quite as a rarity during this time era of American presidents being elected at the second half of the 19th century, Cleveland was not a veteran of the Civil War. He had not served in the Civil War because the draft that had come up during the Civil War, of course, Cleveland was a political Democrat at the time. He did not fully agree with Lincoln and the Republican Party's policies during the Civil War. He had his own political views of it. And although he was drafted, the draft did have a part of it where said you could either serve when you were drafted or you needed to find somebody as a replacement who could serve your duration of your term. And this is the option that Cleveland took. Cleveland went ahead and paid a Polish immigrant to take his place when he was drafted during the Civil War. And in case any of you were wondering, the Polish immigrant did live. The man that took Cleveland's place did not die on the battlefields of the Civil War. He actually did live. So we don't have to say that, Cleveland, he absolutely, he chickened out of service and somebody else got shot and killed instead in his place. That did not happen in this case. There were other cases that did happen. But you got to keep in mind here, that was part of the law. They were legally allowed to do this, that you could pay somebody to take your place if you were drafted. And this is the option that Cleveland took. The Polish immigrant that would take his place was drafted in accordance with this. The actual act that it was the Conscription Act of 1863 is what provided this getaway clause that Cleveland took to avoid serving in the military conflict. His first political office was as sheriff of Erie County, New York, which he got in 1871. He would serve for 2 years as sheriff of Erie County, and then while he was sheriff, carried out the hanging of 3 convicted murderers. He would also return to his law practice in 1873 after finishing out his time as a sheriff. In 1881, Cleveland was convinced to run for mayor of Buffalo, New York, as a reformer of a corrupt city government. Cleveland was very much seen himself as a reformer from the big political machines of the day that were running the machine politics, where Republicans generally had kind of supported that and kind of gotten involved with that quite generally. Democrats at this time, although they had also benefited from it, they were becoming one of the first factions to really call for some kind of reform to happen at the time. Republicans were still iffy with it, but by the early 1880s, they're starting to finally come around and say, okay, this needs to change. And Cleveland ran on that kind of a platform. He ended up winning election that year and took office in 1882. He gained a reputation as an opponent of machine politics while in office, and he was soon asked to run as the Democratic candidate for New York governor shortly after, as the Democrats started to see Cleveland as kind of a rising star within the party that could gain electability. In 1883, Cleveland would take office as governor of New York after he was eventually elected to that role as he ran, and was opposed to unnecessary government. While governor of New York, he vetoed 8 bills that were sent by the legislature within the first 2 months. Quite a bit of vetoes, and that was a record that Cleveland was going to set early on that he would also continue during his presidency, as we will see. He was very much a veto man. If he did not agree with it, Cleveland's first response was veto, veto, veto. He was very much a veto president in many ways. While he was governor, unfortunately, though, he would end up making enemies within his own party, like the Tammany Hall machine in New York City, which would be very much opposed to him because of his anti-political machine politics. That he was not a big supporter of that at all. He would win the respect of New York State Assemblyman Theodore Roosevelt, who would also be a future president, who we will before long get to, and reform-minded Republicans as well would also regard Cleveland as a possible presidential candidate. And that was going to be something that the Democrats were really going to latch on to. The fact that this man, although he's part of our party, there are even reform-minded Republicans who are actually liking this dude. And because of that, if he's liked by people across the aisle, he could be a possible candidate to put forward for president that could actually win us the presidency back for the first time since 1857. So Republicans in the 1884 election would kind of have their own tossles in the 1884 election, but eventually they would settle on nominating Senator James G. Blaine of Maine, and the Democrats would nominate Cleveland as their nominee for president at the 1884 convention. And the race between Cleveland and Blaine in the 1884 presidential election actually became quite heated by many standards. Mind you, we've had a couple of elections that have become quite heated in American history. We can take the example of the election of 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. You can take the 1824 election between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. You can take the 1860 election, where we had the country on the brink of civil war. You could take, the 1876 between Hayes and Tilden. You could take, I'm trying to think here of some other hotly debated ones that have come up, is particularly. Well, let's go for some more recent ones. Obviously, we have the big election in 2000 that the Supreme Court actually had to decide, and I still kind of argue whether or not they made the right decision on certain grounds, looking at all the evidence. And then you have, of course, the two probably most recent hot elections were, of course, in 2016 and most recently the 2020 presidential election that everybody has got some kind of an opinion about. But those are examples. We've had these hot elections before. 1884 is kind of the same thing, mostly because the two candidates are going all out at each other, trying to discredit the other, trying to attack the other, trying to hurt their public image so that they are seen as unelectable by the electorate. And this gets quite heated. Blaine, he had been a congressman for some time, and as such, he had also become implicated in multiple financial scandals that had occurred back in the Gilded Age politics of Congress. And because of that, Blaine has this reputation for being a crook, for being corrupt, and people are holding that to him. Cleveland, on the other hand, ends up, while he's not been in Congress, he is been involved in a marital affair that involved involved him fathering a child with a woman that he was not married to. Mind you, Cleveland was elected as a bachelor. He was not married. And he admitted to having paid child support in 1874 to a woman who he had fathered her child, supposedly. At least that's what she claimed. Whether or not Cleveland actually admitted to having fathered the child was regardless. He admitted that he had at least paid child support to keep the woman from coming out and complaining about it. And that ended up with two very big slogans on opposite sides of the aisle for both the Republicans and the Democrats in the 1884 election. And the first one that came up with was Democrats. This was a common Democratic cheer during the election, was Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, Continental Liar from the state of Maine. And as a contrast, the Republicans came up with the one of Ma, Ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House. Ha, ha, ha. Basically alluring to the fact that Cleveland had a child out of wedlock, which was not really something that a lot of people were willing to divulge in back then as a respectable thing to just push under the rug. Cleveland, regardless of the heated election that had come about in 1884, Cleveland would win the election with support of mugwump Republicans who would be opposed to Blaine and thus tip the election in his favor. The election for electoral votes, you need a total in 1884, a majority would be 201. Cleveland took 219 electoral votes compared to Blaine's 182. Cleveland won 48.8% of the popular vote, with Blaine winning 48.3%. So the popular vote was pretty evenly split. And even the electoral vote really isn't that far. You got to think of this: 201 was needed, and Cleveland only got it by 18 votes, and that meant that's about as many as Blaine was off of. Blaine would have been off of roughly, I'm going to try to think here, plus 18, 19 votes, I think. But either way, very close. It was a fairly close election, but Cleveland ultimately did get elected. And this right here, we have a very early photograph of President Cleveland. We do not actually have a date on this one. This is an undated photograph of him during his youth. But back then, he actually had a full-on beard. Later in his life, of course, as we can see in his presidential portrait, he gave up the beard, but he always kept the mustache. So I'm going to guess this probably during his early career when he started to get involved in politics in New York, maybe around the time of the Civil War, maybe. Just guessing on it. Here we have a political cartoon from Puck magazine back in the day, which was quite known for its political cartoons. And this is a caricature of Senator James G. Blaine, who was Cleveland's opponent in the 1884 election, where these people are basically, all the senators in the Senate are looking at him, and he has all these tattoos on him of these numerous financial scandals that he's purportedly been involved in, that he's now seeming ashamed of, that he has all these scandals that he's got tattooed on his body, but it's implicating all the things that Blaine has been involved in. And this was a legitimate concern of a lot of people, which ultimately caused a faction of Republicans to go for Cleveland instead of voting for their own party's candidate. And then here we have a political cartoon from the magazine The Judge, which depicts Cleveland with his whole affair, his whole child that he had supposedly fathered with a woman he wasn't married to and had paid child support for her, where this is very much alluring to that, which would kind of haunt Cleveland during the 1884 campaign. Even though he had paid the child support and everything had been settled there, the fact that he had supposedly fathered a child with somebody that he wasn't married to was enough to damage his reputation. And then here we have the electoral map of the 1888 president, not 1888, 1884. I wrote the wrong year on here. I'm thinking of his loser bid. This would be the 1884 election, the electoral vote of what went. So, as expected, Cleveland, as I mentioned, Democrats' political power at this time was mostly in the southern states. So he got all the southern states, as we could probably predictably know. And what got him the victory, of course, was winning some of these northern ones, such as getting Missouri and Indiana, even taking a couple, Connecticut, I think, what was it? Yeah, Connecticut up here. He took, of course, his state of New York that he was working in, his home state of New Jersey went for him, and that kind of tipped the election in his favor. But a fairly close election. Cleveland, upon winning the 1884 election, he would take the presidential oath of office on March 4th of 1885, as outgoing President Chester A. Arthur, who had inherited Garfield's term, would leave office. So that would start Cleveland's first term as president, because this is going to be a little weird here because we got to split the terms. So Cleveland would continue, upon taking office, he would end up continuing Arthur's policy of basically basing political appointments on merit. Arthur had, of course, started this with the Civil Service Reform Act. The Pendleton Act, I think, is what it was called, if I remember correctly. And that was the act that finally got rid of the old spoil system. It got rid of, just giving political appointments based on whether or not you supported me or who you were. Now you actually had to have the merits, the actual qualifications to hold that position. And Cleveland would very much continue that policy, because that's always a concern, because although it's been signed into law, there's been presidents who will try to reverse their predecessors' achievements and their predecessors' work. This has happened many times. And this was something of a concern. Will Cleveland uphold that act? Will Cleveland, being a reformer himself, agreed with Arthur having done that and had no problem with keeping that in place? and it would become permanent. It would never actually be reversed. It's still the norm today. And Cleveland would try to reduce government spending during his time in office, and he would use the veto power. As we mentioned, he had vetoed 8 times during the first 2 months being governor of New York. And upon taking the office of president, Cleveland would actually use the veto power more than any of his predecessors up to that point. He's not the most vetoes of any president, but of all the 21 presidents that had come before him, he has used it more than any of them in just his term of office. Even Andrew Jackson back in the day used quite a bit of veto, and Cleveland even beat him on the amount of vetoes that he issued on policies that he didn't want for anything that he wanted to reduce government spending, and if he thought it was an unnecessary government expense, he would not support it in any way. Not to say that a couple of those bills didn't eventually get overridden anyway, and the veto got overridden, but Cleveland very much had put his disapproval of it by stamping that veto on it. And Cleveland was also a non-interventionist in foreign policy and would fight for protective tariffs to be lowered, so that way he kind of argued if we put higher tariffs on our goods, it's going to encourage these countries to have basically trade wars with us, and he didn't want that. He thought that it would be better to lower these tariffs, thus inciting these other countries to not up theirs. Cleveland, who had entered office, as we mentioned, as a bachelor, actually married during his first term in office. He married in the White House. He was the first president. Not the first president. He is the only president to actually marry in the White House. There's been other presidents who married while they were president, but Cleveland was the only one to actually have the marriage done at the White House. He didn't, like Woodrow Wilson got remarried, but it was not at the White House that he got remarried in. And John Tyler got remarried, but he did not have it at the White House. Cleveland did. He ended up marrying Frances Folsom in 1886. She was our youngest First Lady, as she was only 21 years old when Cleveland married her, and she had been a student at Wells College in New York. Cleveland was 27 years older than her. Yeah, that might draw a couple of eyes. That's a little concerning in my opinion. They did end up having 5 children. Of these 5 children, one of them was named Ruth, and that is actually, coincidentally, it is commonly believed, most people think that the Baby Ruth candy bar is named after the baseball player, Babe Ruth. And that is actually not the case. The candy bar had actually come out some time before, and it is speculated that during the 1890s, when the candy bar had come out, that it very well may have been named for Baby Ruth, the president's the president's young daughter that had been born. They think that might be named where the candy bar actually came from. We have no confirmation that that is, but it is generally thought that that is more likely where the name came from, given the time. And this is a picture of Mrs. Frances Cleveland. She was quite young. She would actually live, I think, until 1947. She actually lived for some time after Cleveland. Cleveland died in 1908. So she got to see World War I and World War II, and she lived for some time. But just the fact that she was 27 years younger than him, barely out of college, was kind of a little odd by today's standards. Now, back then, that wasn't exactly frowned upon, but today that would probably not be a go-getter. And she ended up being a little prophetic, too, because as they were leaving the White House in 1889, as they're leaving the White House and Benjamin Harrison is coming in, Frances had actually told the maids in the White House to keep everything as it was, keep it organized, because we will be back. And prophetically, 4 years later, they were. Cleveland ended up running for re-election in 1892 and getting back in the White House. So it was kind of odd that Frances had somehow prophetically correctly predicted that they would return to the White House at some point. Cleveland's tariff stance would actually come back to haunt him in the 1888 election. It cost him because people were very much not really for the lower tariffs, because they view tariffs as protecting their businesses. And this was very much the case in northeastern states, like including New York, that had been vital to Cleveland's election in 1884, that had gone for him and kind of tipped the scale, because the voters there said that their industrial jobs had now been threatened by the lower tariffs. And that was a big backfire to Cleveland, because Cleveland was a low tariff man. He was not going to budge on that issue. And that ended up costing him the 1888 election against former Indiana Senator Benjamin Harrison, who was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the ninth president. And Harrison ended up winning the election that year because of that. So because he pursued these lower tariffs, it alienated him from these vital voters that had tipped the election in his favor up in the northeastern states. And that ended up costing him the election in 1888 when he ran for reelection. So Cleveland lost the 1888 election. He would return to New York City after leaving office, and took a law firm job for the next 4 years while there. In 1892, he would decide, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try this again, because at this point, Harrison has become known as the human iceberg. He's not a very affable president. He's not very friendly. He's not very talkative, and people are generally not satisfied with Harrison's job as president either. So Cleveland correctly surmises, I could probably run against him and have just as equal chance now as I did 4 years ago. So in 1892, he decides, I'm going to run again. Harrison did not campaign personally during the 1892 campaign, partly because of the factor that his wife, Caroline, was dying at the time of tuberculosis. She ended up dying toward the very end of Harrison's term. I think it was toward the end of 1892 that she ended up passing away. And Cleveland ended up winning re-election in 1892, since voters had changed their minds on the tariffs, and the Tammany Hall had actually came in and supported him for once, because they were opposed to Harrison. The vote in the 1892 election, 223 votes were needed for a majority, and Cleveland would come away with a much larger margin this time of 277, and Harrison only got 145 of the electoral votes. The popular vote, 46% went to Cleveland, and 43% went to Harrison. And thus would begin Cleveland's second presidential term, which is separated from his first. And this here is electoral map of the 1892 election that Cleveland actually ended up winning. As we can see, he actually won a little bit wider margin in the north than he had last time. He recaptured New York and the states that had gone against him but at this time he also gained Illinois and Wisconsin, and he had some states out here that have now gone for him, and even captured some single electoral votes from states that were still Republican or third party, but had to give one of their electoral votes away because Cleveland had gotten such an amount of support in them. So Cleveland would return to office on March 4th, 1893, 4 years after having left office on his first term, and his second term would open up with the country's worst financial crisis in its history. Cleveland's second term was very much more of a disaster than his first, as is the case in a lot of presidents. There are quite a few presidents that their second term is often much worse than their first. And it's not everyone, not every president is worse, but more often than not, it is worse. Why? We don't know. But in Cleveland's case, it was just a couple weeks after he took office, I believe, that the Panic of 1893 hit the country. And up to this point, this had been the worst economic depression that the country had seen. Mind you, the Great Depression has not hit yet. The Panic of 1893 started with a railroad bankruptcy in February, which was followed by bank failures, nationwide credit crises, and a stock market crash, plus 3 more railroad failures. It was an almost complete breakdown of the American economy at the time, and there were people who honestly thought that the whole country was going to collapse. Unemployment rose to 19%, and a series of strikes would cripple coal and transportation industries in 1894, the following year. The American economy did not fully recover from the Panic of 1893 until 1896 to 97, when Cleveland is leaving office at the end of his second term and President William McKinley is coming in. When the Klondike gold rush up in Alaska would actually begin the rapid growth for the next 10 years. The gold that was being generated from that gold rush would help finally stabilize the economy. But during Cleveland's second term, the economy is pretty much in shambles and trying to recover. It's not a very good economy. Cleveland was inconsistent during this time on his social views, and these were a couple things that he did during his second term. He opposed Chinese immigration discrimination in the West, which had been passed by Republican presidents, which they had gone ahead and passed the Chinese Immigration Exclusion Acts that barred Chinese immigration for so many years, and Cleveland was against that. He opposed the annexation of Hawaii, and about a year or two earlier, the American plantation owners and on the Kingdom of Hawaii had actually overthrown the native Hawaiian government and the monarchy there and asked to be annexed by the American government. President Harrison had actually been somewhat sympathetic and amiable toward doing this, but when Cleveland took office and had an investigation done, he came to conclude that the means of which the native Hawaiians had been overthrown was kind of shady at best and very much not the wish of the native Hawaiians at all, and thus he kind of saw the corrupt practices there. And Cleveland at heart was an anti-imperialist, and he did not want to go and attain more overseas territory, so he pretty much down vetoed during his second term any possibility that he would work to try to get Hawaii annexed into the United States. Eventually that did happen with his successor, William McKinley, but it would not happen during Cleveland's term. And maybe that's something we'll go through one day, is how did the U.S. get Hawaii? Maybe we can, that's a video we should look into doing, because that is actually a quite interesting story. You'll never look at Dole Fruit Company the same way again, I can tell you that. But that was another thing that he had done. He also, during his time in office, did not support equality for African Americans or voting rights for women. He was an opponent of both of those. And he also thought that Native Americans would be best suited if they would assimilate into white culture and to preserve their own culture. He thought if they would assimilate into American society, that they would have a better chance at preserving their culture. Of course, that is absolutely ludicrous, because by assimilating into a culture, you lose your own. I don't know why he would ever think that. And that was not something that was going to be any realistic doubt. But Cleveland very much was a believer that this was what needed to happen. And because of that, he had supported the Dawes Act during the 1890s that had sought to try to accomplish this. Of course, that didn't fully work. And thank God, plenty of the Native American cultures, although they have been significantly hurt, they have managed to preserve at least some form of their native tribal identities to this day and their traditions, which thank God they have. And Cleveland would end up, at the end of his second term, losing a mass of support when he blew a huge defeat to organized labor, because in 1894 there was a massive railroad strike with the Pullman Car Company, and they ended up sending federal troops to go in and crush it, and they did open fire on these unionists who had actually organize a strike, and that lost him quite a bit of support among the organized unionized workers during that time. Enough that Cleveland knew there was no shot that he was even going to try to run for a third term, that there was absolutely no point of him even trying to do it. Another thing that had significantly happened, as we'll mention here during Cleveland's term, was he was very much an opponent of basing the U.S. currency on silver, which had been a debate that had happened ever since President Hayes and the act that had gotten passed there with the Bland-Allison Act with the silver dollars and resumption of silver coinage. And basing it on silver had been done because you had a lot of silver mines out west that were looking to make a big profit, and if the government was buying silver for currency, that would be beneficial to them. Cleveland, during the Panic of 1893, kind of saw that that was actually weakening the economy further, and it was causing a massive depreciation in value of the money. So he went ahead and switched it back to a gold-based standard, which the U.S. currency would remain even after he left office. And although silver people at the time, silver interests had kind of seen it as just a temporary setback, it did pretty much mark the end of the U.S. currency being based upon silver. It did mark the beginning of the end for that, because it would never be fully restored back to a silver-based currency. And that would happen during Cleveland's administration, and perhaps one of his lasting impacts would be moving the U.S. back to a gold-based standard, which did help a little bit. It didn't completely stop the depreciation of the money, but it slowed the rate of it. It did massively slow down the rate of which the money was depreciating by going and switching it to a gold-based standard. So the final years of Cleveland's life was relatively not massively eventful. By the fall of 1896, Cleveland was quite unpopular within his own party. His second term had been pretty much almost a pure disaster, and he pretty much, although some still wanted him to run for a third term, Cleveland kind of recognized how unpopular he was and said, no, I think I better decline that. I'm not going to try because I don't think I have the support. So he ended up declining. He would leave office in 1897. The Democrats would instead, in 1896, nominate famous former Nebraska Senator William Jennings Bryan, who would run multiple times as the party's nominee and never won the presidential election all the times that he ran, but he was a very skilled orator, as we'll see in the next coming couple presidential elections. He was a very skilled orator. And Bryan ended up losing the 1896 election to Republican nominee William McKinley of Ohio, who I've actually got to go see the grave of. And Cleveland, upon leaving office, would retire to his home in Princeton, New Jersey. After leaving it in 1897, he would go back and just go into retirement. He didn't go back into a law firm or anything of that manner, as most presidents kind of choose to retire once their job is all said and done. He would serve as a trustee of Princeton University in New Jersey until his death. He refused calls from the Democrats in 1904 to run again against Theodore Roosevelt, as they felt that he might be one of the few people within the party that could stand a chance against Roosevelt. But Cleveland, remembering how unpopular he'd been at the close of his second term and being into his retirement at that point, said, I'm done with politics, guys. I don't have any interest in running again. So in 1904, despite the fact for calls from Democrats that he should try to run for a third term, he decided, no, I'm done. I'm retired. In 1907, Cleveland's health ended up beginning to fail on him, and he ended up dying on June 24th of 1908 at the age of 71 of a heart attack. His reported last words were, and this is a quote of what he supposedly had said, was, I have tried so hard to do right. So Cleveland is a unique president in regards, he holds that distinction of being the only president to have two separate terms, and it really revolves around the differing policy views of Americans at that time, of how they viewed certain things in politics and how they were willing to change on certain issues. But very much, Cleveland is an average president, I think. I don't think he did massively horribly on his first term, but his second term very much was a disaster, and that is ultimately what cost him any sort of popularity he had. And I think it cost the Democrats for about 20 years, because they would not regain the White House until 1912, during the 1912 election, and that was about almost 20 years down the road. So the legacy of Cleveland very much, I think, hurt the Democrats a little bit more for a while more. And very much, he's not a horrible president, but he's not the most spectacular. And the last photo we have here to go along with President Cleveland would be this photo here. This is supposedly one of the last photos that was taken of him. This is about 1907, so this would be about 1 year before he passed away. And by that point, he is looking a little rather frail at that point. So that concludes for this video. And so if anyone has any questions, any comments, any suggestions, I'll be more than happy to look through them. But just make sure you put them in the comment section below, and I'll go through them and when I can get to them. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I will be on vacation next week, so I will not be having a video uploaded next week. We will upload one the following week, so 2 weeks from now. So this is our last video for 2 weeks. So hopefully everything goes well with everyone else. I don't believe I have anything more to add, so hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here in 2 weeks for our next video.